which is called Israel or called Palestine. And sometimes you get people coming from far away, let's say from the US, tell us, you know, this is an ancient problem. Jews and Arabs have always been fighting each other. There's always been war in the Middle East. And we say, wait, no. There's always been war in the Middle East is sort of true. In the same sense that everywhere where there's been people, there's been war. But if you take, let's say, the last 500 years and you compare the Middle East to, let's say, Western Europe, this has been a very peaceful part of the world. Generally, people here have gotten along with each other better than most. Which is not to say we have not. But Jews and Arabs have always been fighting each other. It's just simply untrue. It's also what we call an anachronism. It couldn't be true. It's using words that, because 100 years ago in Jerusalem, if you came 100 years ago to Jerusalem, ask people, what nationality are you? Most people probably would not have a straightforward answer for you because they didn't think about it so much, about nationality. Nationality was not a big deal in Jerusalem 100 years ago. People identified by the religious community that they belonged to. They identified by social class, they identified by clan, that is extended family, and but nationality not so much. There wasn't even a political unit called Israel or Palestine 100 years ago. 100 years ago, Jerusalem was part of the Ottoman Empire, which extended over a huge area, including pretty much everything we call today the Middle East and more. Within that, where exactly was Jerusalem? Also, you could hear different people giving different answers. Some people 100 years ago might tell you, a lot of people might tell you Jerusalem is in Syria, okay, in southern Syria, the whole area between Egypt and Iraq was known as Syria. So this could be in southern Syria. It could be just part of the Ottoman Empire, part of the Damascus province. Different ideas. The name Palestine existed 100 years ago, added the name the Land of Israel. The Land of Israel was a name that Jews used for religious reasons to refer to the ancient place that Jews came from. Palestine referred mostly 100 years ago to Jerusalem and Jaffa and a certain area around them, which was known to the local people as Palestine, but it wasn't a political unit, Palestine. Okay? Just as, I don't know, the Midwest or something. It was described an area, much smaller than the Midwest, but described some area, but not a political unit. So 100 years ago, nationalism was small, and if you came to people, if people did identify nationally in Jerusalem 100 years ago, mostly it would have been as Arabs. Okay? And you could get people telling you that they are Muslim Arabs, that they are Christian Arabs, and that they are Jewish Arabs. The idea that Jew and Arab is a mutually exclusive category did not exist then. So the idea that to say that Jews and Arabs were fighting each other just doesn't make sense. So the problem that we have in this country is a modern problem. It's about 100 years old. It's a political problem, specifically it's a national problem. It's a problem to do with national movements and the idea of nationality, which 100 years ago was very small in Jerusalem, but very big in Europe. And especially what's relevant for us now is to say in Eastern Europe, where most of the Jews were living at that time, there was a lot of nationalism 100 years ago. And a lot of that nationalism was also anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic. People saying, we the real Poles, not the Jews. We the real Russians, not the Jews. And with that, the beginning of attacks on Jews, of systemic discrimination against Jews. And with that, the idea that more and more Jews had that they need to leave Eastern Europe. The most common strategy was westward migration. To the United States, to Latin America, to Australia, to, which is not exactly west, but all different places out of Eastern Europe, Jews wanted to go. Another idea was the idea of assimilation. We'll try to become, just mix in and start speaking Polish, Russian, whatever it is, become. And the third idea, which 100 years ago was very small, was the Zionist idea. It was a small group of journalists and intellectuals who got together and said, you know what, Jews are not just a religious or an ethnic group, we are or we should be a nation. And as such, we should have a nation state. And they had their first meeting, the first Zionist Congress, they called it, in 1897. and they were talking about what to do, and they started doing the movement is still doing by somewhat different means. But in the beginning, the first part, trying to physically move people here, had very little success. Because the Ottoman Empire had laws that made it difficult for immigrants to just come, buy up land, build new towns. There was limits on immigration, limits on foreigners buying land, as almost any country in the world has. So this was a very slow progress. And you could say basically most of these laws are designed also to counter something like this. Or suddenly some big population out of somewhere else to come over and take over some country. So the Zionists were not so successful in that. They killed small numbers of people here at great expense. But they were more successful in the lobbying department. Not so much of the Ottoman Empire, which ruled here, but was not interested, but much more with the European powers. Who also realized there was an issue with Jews in Europe. And often you could say there's also anti-Semites in Europe supported the Zionist idea. They said, yes, let's please get all the Jews out of here to somewhere else. And so the British government came to support this idea. And in 1917, in World War I, the British conquered this country. And from there on really begins our modern political issue. Because in 1917, when the British conquered this country, they issue a declaration called the Balfour. Balfour was the foreign minister of Britain, the Balfour Declaration. It says, His Majesty's government looks favorably upon the founding of a national home for the Jews in Palestine. And goes on to say that this will be done without any infringement on the social, political, religious rights of the non-Jewish population. At that time, in 1917, Jews are about 7% of the population of this country. This then begs the question, what do you mean when you say I'm going to give a national home to 7% of the population of this country in this country without infringing on the rights of the other 93%? This is a real question. If anybody has an answer, we're glad to hear it. Because it's been, 97 years or so, and we're still stuck with this problem. What does it mean? So the British changed the law. They basically made unlimited immigration. You don't need to be a resident to buy land. Many more Jews from Europe started coming, trying to buy large tracts of land to settle people on. But it was difficult to do because most of the people in this country, the owners of the land, were the people working the land, and they didn't have the idea of selling because they didn't know where they're going to go. If they sell, what the Zionists did find, they found in some places something like a feudal system. So a wealthy person living in a city far away who owns the whole lands of a village, and they bought from those people. And then they came to those villagers and told them, all right, at the end of this year you should leave. Because we bought the land, and the villagers said, no, we've always lived here, we come with the land, you bought it, you get 1/3 of our wheat. And the Zionists said, no, we don't want 1/3 of your wheat. If you had any idea how much we paid for this, we want to bring Jews from Europe to make them farmers here in the Holy Land, and you have to leave. And those people got evicted. And that was one of several things that happened in the 1920s to cause the people of this country to start to realize they have a problem. Now, it took a while for a few reasons, but one reason is that this country was a new idea. It was the British came in with a ruler and said, the map of the British Mandate, I hope I have one. All right. Yeah, what's painted here in orange, Western Palestine, that's what the British said, here will be the national home for the Jews. Okay? They came with a ruler and they made this. Previous to this, the people of Haifa certainly thought that they belonged in one political unit with Beirut, probably didn't think that they belonged in one political unit with the Bedouins of the Negev Desert. And so on. I mean, these borders are sort of arbitrary. And in that sense, they are like, I don't know what, about 2/3 of the borders of the world. All the borders in Africa, many parts of the world, that some outside power came and said, all right, this is now, I don't know what, Kenya. There's so many people with different languages, with different cultures. They're thrown into these things. They have to get organized. They don't have a choice now. They have to get organized together. and form what eventually becomes known as the Palestinian National Movement. Even in the old city of Jerusalem, I know how much you talked about it, there was a Moroccan neighborhood, a Sudanese neighborhood, an Indian neighborhood, an Afghan neighborhood. There was people here who had all different kinds of heritage and language and culture. Basically, everybody who was here in 1917 and was not a Jew, this is Palestinian. Okay? These people who had to get organized together, and they were mostly Muslim, but also there was many Christians among them, to get together and say, we the Palestinians demand. And their demand that they made to the British when they started to get organized was basically put back the old limits on immigration, on foreigners buying land, make laws protecting tenant farmers, which the British said no way. We're committed to the Balfour Declaration, we're committing to helping the Jews of Europe get a state here. And it took really the outbreak of unorganized, quite violent Palestinian riots against Jews and British in the summer of 1929 to cause the British to rethink their position and say, you know what, we'll put some limits on immigration, some limits on land buying. At which point Zionists got very upset. Look, this is 1929, Hitler is coming to power in Germany, fascism is on the rise all over Europe, North America has gone into its depression, there is no more visas for immigrants to come in, the Jews of Europe need somewhere to go, this is the one place you promised us, now we're stuck, what's going to happen to us? From this point on, from 1929 to 1930, we can clearly say we have in this country two competing national movements, as we have to this day. In the beginning, the British are between them until they leave, and basically the Palestinians are demanding put limits on Jewish immigration from Europe, and the Zionists are demanding no limits on Zionist immigration from Europe. And this is, the British are trying to maneuver between them, and they fail. To make a long story short, in 1947, the British say, we're leaving this country. Let the United Nations decide what to do with it. So the United Nations forms the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, which comes here in 1947. They're supposed to make a plan for a partition, how to divide this country into two states, an Arab state and a Jewish state. This whole thing, painted here in orange, this whole Western Palestine is the size of New Jersey. Right? We're talking now about dividing it into two states. There's many issues with that. The Palestinians leadership generally say, we reject the idea of partition. Even before you show us any particular map, the very idea of partition is unacceptable. Why? We are the real people of this country. These are new immigrants. How come they should get a part of it? Also, if we go through a little bit of numbers, 1947, Jews are about 30%, a little less than 1/3 the population of this country. Most of them new immigrants, right? It was 7% in 1917. And most of them living in the cities, as new immigrants tend to do. Okay? Usually when you have immigrant migration, you come into a city, maybe later spread out to the suburbs and the countryside. But in 1947, the Jews are about 30% of this country, and most of them are living in cities. So in the big cities, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Jaffa, and Haifa, it's about 50-50 Jews and non-Jews at this point. And in the countryside, it's about 90% non-Jews. And this begs the question, how do you divide that? Okay? Where is the line that you can draw to divide a country where the cities are 50-50 and the countryside is 90%? And the Palestinians say there is no such thing. The British leave, fine, that's good. Then we will have local independence. In that situation, of course, there would be a big Arab majority, and they could put back laws limiting immigration and stay an Arab country with a Jewish minority. So the Palestinians rejected the very idea of partition. The Zionists lobbied the UN to try to promote the best possible partition plan for themselves. And after some deliberation, the UN ended up making a very funny map to be seen here. Okay, this map never happened. I'm showing it to you half only just for the laughs. But let's say the gray was a proposed Arab state, the yellow was a proposed Jewish state, and Jerusalem and Bethlehem here in red were supposed to be an international zone governed by. How does a border that looks like this work? Or like this? What is an international zone? What citizenship do people have? What law applies in it? Who controls its borders? Something most of you probably cannot see from your seats. A little gray dot here is the city of Jaffa. It's supposed to be a little island of Arab state inside the Jewish state. How is that supposed to work? We don't know. But what we can say is that this is an amazing example of what you call in North America gerrymandering.
Yeah.
Okay, because here we have less than 1/3 of the people are getting a little bit more than half the country. And in the proposed Arab state, painted here in gray, there is about 99% Arab, 1% Jew. In the yellow state, the proposed Jewish state, there is about 55% Jews, 45% Arabs. Meaning we've drawn the largest possible district that has in it some Jewish majority. To do that, the UN has done some very strange things. The strangest probably, I don't know, it's hard, but the strangest is probably the city of Jaffa being a little island of Arab state inside the Jewish state. Why? Because Jaffa was the biggest city in Palestine. And if Jaffa were made part of the Jewish state, there would be an Arab majority in the Jewish state. So in order to gerrymander this majority, you have to do some very funny things. Anyways, this map was drawn by the UN. Everybody who looked at it, who lived in this country or knew it well, said this is never going to happen. Okay. Also the Zionists who had lobbied to try to get the best possible partition plan said this is unacceptable to us. But they didn't say it publicly. They said, look, we don't want border that looks like this. We need to have a contiguous state. We don't want islands of Arab state inside our Jewish state. And we don't want Jerusalem, which is the single biggest concentration of Jewish population, to be accessible only through the Arab state. So we don't like this plan. However, it doesn't really matter. Because what? Because we know what's really going to happen. If this plan is approved, then the British will feel free to leave. Okay, this is a trick that you may be a little bit onto. If you conquer a country, let's say you're an imaginary empire, and you invade some faraway country for unclear reasons.
What are you talking about?
No, it's just theoretical. And after 10 years, 15, however many, you say, all right, actually, this is not a good place for me, I'd like to leave. It's hard to do so diplomatically, publicly, without showing some sort of achievement, some sort of local independence, something that you... So the British wanted to save face. They needed something to show what's happening when they're leaving. And the Zionists said, look, if this is approved by the UN, then the British will feel comfortable to leave. But it's never going to actually happen. Okay? Its chances of long-term success are similar to those of Hamid Karzai. It's not a workable plan, but it's something. And therefore, what happens is we're going to lobby in the UN for this to happen, and we're going to prepare for what happens when it happens, which is the British are going to leave and we're going to have civil war. Okay, so the Zionists are in two heads. One of them is working hard in the UN and around it to lobby for the approval of this plan. And the other is, this is 1947, in Europe trying to buy the leftover weapons of World War II. And here in this country trying to train and organize militias, arm them, coordinate them, prepare them for the coming war. And they say, look, we don't like this map, but we support it, one, so the British leave. Two, after the war, which is going to happen when the British leave, the UN is going to come back into the picture to negotiate a truce or something, possibly, and we will be at a diplomatic advantage saying we supported the plan, the war was not our fault. So, in fact, this plan is approved by the UN on 29th November 1947. It's also the date we usually give as the first day of the 1948 war, which began as a civil war between Zionists and Palestinians inside this country, which went on for about 6 months, and in which Zionists pretty soon emerged to be the clear winners. Although there were fewer people, they were much better armed and much, much better organized. The Palestinian national movement was still largely an abstract idea. In the end, when a village was attacked, it was pretty much the village to itself. They didn't have, what the Zionists had, a command structure, people to move people across the country from place to place according to a plan. So the Zionists were very clearly winning the first part of the war, which was mostly fought about controlling the main roads, most intensely the road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, but not only. And part of the Zionist tactic in this part of the war came to be also to conquer the villages, the Palestinian villages and towns along that road and clear them of their inhabitants in order to make corridors, what they called. And they started with this creating what became known later as the Palestinian refugee problem. That is, the people of those villages and towns going across away from where the Zionist forces were conquering and ended up in UN-run refugee camps. The second part of this war begins in May of 1948 when the last British soldier officially left, because the first 6 months of civil war were happening while the British were still here but busy with their pullout, and mostly staying out of this, except when it came too close to a British person or interest. But then stage 2 begins in May of 1948 with the surrounding Arab countries sending in troops. In theory, the surrounding Arab countries are sending in troops to help their Palestinian brothers. In fact, the surrounding Arab countries were and are probably better at making statements than at actually committing their troops to things outside their own borders. Syria and Lebanon made very fancy statements about helping Palestinians, but sent in a very small number of troops, which basically left the moment they met the first organized resistance. Jordan and Egypt made a more serious effort, sent in troops, trying to, their plan was, they also were very poorly coordinated between each other, but their plan was for Egypt to try to get the areas proposed for the Arab state close to Egypt, and the Jordanians to try to get the areas proposed for the Arab state close to Jordan. Now, in theory, they were talking about they're getting these things for the Palestinians. But actually, when the war ended, all right, this little bit of Palestine here ended up being controlled by Egypt, and this much larger bit of Palestine here, what became known as the West Bank, became controlled by Jordan. Now, in theory, Jordan and Egypt had come in to help the Palestinians. Actually, at the end of the war, Jordan said, this is a lovely new part of Jordan. Okay, they never even gave official consideration to the idea of giving Palestinians independence in this area. So the state of Israel went, or the Zionist movement went from the best offer it could lobby for in the UN, okay, 55% of British Palestine, to what it got in the war and in the armistice agreement at the end of the war, almost 80% of the country. Contiguous. And not just contiguous, but here they have a 55% Jewish majority in 60% of the country. Here they've got an almost 90% Jewish majority in 80% of the country, because most of the Palestinians have become refugees during this war. And this, first of all, this event, the 1948 war, is known in Hebrew generally as the War of Independence, and in Arabic as the catastrophe. Okay, it refers to the same event. And it has taught the Zionist leadership, the leadership of what now becomes the State of Israel, a very important lesson. Put into immortal words by our first Prime Minister, who I cannot translate properly, but said something along the lines that it doesn't matter what the non-Jews say, it matters what the Jews do. Or in other words, this is the best thing we could lobby from the UN, this is what we got in the war. And all the countries of the world recognized this at the end of the war. Not because our cause became in any way more just, or that of the Palestinians less so, but because we were able to create, and this is a big mantra of the Zionist movement, to create facts on the ground. Okay, we moved the people, conquered the area, we forced the world to recognize this, in fact. These became the borders of the State of Israel for the next 19 years. After 19 years, in 1967, we had another war. And I realize we'd go maybe more deeply into how it started and why, but our time is almost up. We had another war in 1967, in which Israel conquered the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. West Bank, and by the way, the West Bank includes here where we're sitting. Okay, Jerusalem was split down the middle. The old city and the area east of it was Jordanian controlled. Between 1948 and 1967. 1967, Israel came in and conquered this. Jerusalem and the whole West Bank. Now, the 1967 war was different from the 1948 war in more than one way. But what's relevant for our discussion is, where in 1948 land was conquered and non-Jewish population was mostly removed from the land conquered, in 1967 land was conquered and people stayed put. So now Israel came to control, and just for reasons of expedience I'm going to ignore Gaza for the rest of this discussion, which is a slightly different issue, and focus on the West Bank where we are. So Israel came to control the West Bank and East Jerusalem, full of Palestinian people. Both the people are originally from here, and many refugees who moved in here in 1948. So now at the end of the 1967 war, the Israeli government was facing a political problem which it's basically still facing. What to do with the West Bank and its people, or in a slightly different terminology, what to do with land that we want and people that we don't want. Okay? Why do we want the West Bank is pretty easy to see. Okay? It's the physical center of our country. It's the hills that are overlooking the plains. It's sitting on important underground water resources. And for some people, most importantly, I didn't tell you this, but when the Zionist movement started 100 years ago, they said we have to get the Jews out of Europe. Some people said, let's make a Jewish state in Australia, in East Africa, in South America. All different ideas were thrown out there, but the Zionists in the end said it has to be the land of Israel, because that's where Jews anciently come from, that's where the Bible was written, that's where Jewish culture is focused on historically. Now, if you read the Bible, no part of the Bible takes place in Tel Aviv or in Haifa. The Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, what we call, takes place mostly in Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Hebron, Jericho, Nablus, here in the hills. So the state of Israel, the Jewish state, comes to control this, the biblical Judea and Samaria. On the one hand, they say we cannot just up and leave it. On the other hand, we also don't want to officially annex it, to make it officially a part of the state of Israel, because then we would have to, by Israeli and international law, grant Israeli citizenship to all the people inside this area, who are Palestinians, both originally from here and refugees, and that also we'd have no way then to stop the refugees from coming back to where they got kicked out of in the war. And also, we would risk the Jewish majority in our Jewish state. So what do we do with land that we want and people that we don't want? You would think, remove the people. Okay? But, and that's what was done in 1948. They did a little bit of that in 1967, but they were forced to stop it. Because of the way, and again it's a long story, international and Middle East politics worked, it was just not possible in 1967 to physically remove the population. There was nowhere to send them. So the state of Israel, controlling the West Bank that it wants with people that it doesn't want, says we decide not to decide. We are not going to annex this territory, nor are we going to leave it. We're going to temporarily hold it under military government until such time as... That's our problem, we never finish that sentence. We don't know. don't know exactly what, but we know that. So the military government was put in place in 1967, basically controlling the Palestinians of the West Bank without civil rights. Okay? With some, and the system that was designed, which basically encouraged the Palestinians of the West Bank to come and work in Israel as day laborers and go back in the evening to sleep in the West Bank. Very good for the Israeli economy. Not so bad also in many ways for the West Bank economy. A lot of the refugees, it was the first time they again could buy a house, buy a car, move ahead. And many people you'll find in this country, if you talk to Palestinians and Israelis, are in some way nostalgic for these days. In the 1970s and 1980s, we traveled freely over the country, we worked, we used to go to each other's weddings, Turns out, as nostalgic people are today, that at the time there were many people who were not satisfied with being without civil rights, basically the permanent servant class of another society. And in 1987 there broke out the first Palestinian Intifada. First Palestinian Intifada, very impressive example of popular uprising, not just what you may remember from TV, the throwing of stones at military vehicles and this, but also community council that made schools when the government shut down all the schools, that made clinics when the government shut down all the clinics, which made tax strikes and work strikes, and really forced Israel, which was much more powerful in every way, forced it into a political negotiation. What to do with the West Bank and its people. And this led eventually, in 1993, to the signing of something called the Oslo Accords. Now, the Oslo Accords, many Palestinians to this day think it was a terrible idea to sign them, because basically they don't address what they call the core issues. The Oslo Accords enumerate 5 core issues: the refugees of 1948, the city of Jerusalem, the shared airspace, the shared water resources, and the borders, and says these issues we will leave for a later date, somewhat vague. Meanwhile, we will create a new temporary situation, which is basically was reenacted in Iraq a few years ago. It was called the Surge. I don't know if anybody remembers this, but it was the American forces leaving the cities, or in this case the Israeli forces leaving the cities of the West Bank, placing inside them a local Palestinian police, but keeping a presence all around those cities. The Palestinian autonomy, I'll show you a map of it just to confuse you. This is the West Bank. This is how it's divided in the Oslo Accords. Okay, the little islands or patches, that's the Palestinian autonomy. Inside these patches is a Palestinian police and a Palestinian authority. That authority created in Oslo is nothing like a state. It's more like a group of municipalities, okay, managing inside the towns, because these islands are the towns. Okay, it's only about 40% of the land, but more than 90% of the people are inside these islands living. And inside these islands is a Palestinian autonomy, which is autonomous to a certain degree, but all around it is still the Israeli army, controlling the roads in and out, controlling the airspace, controlling the water resources, controlling the electricity, controlling the gas, the import, the export. And the basic idea of Oslo is to say, you Palestinians end the uprising, quiet down, manage yourselves inside your towns for some years, and then if you do that successfully, later on we'll talk to you about giving you something more like real independence. Meanwhile, already since 1967, Israel had been moving Israeli civilians into the West Bank to set up what's called settlements. And I don't know if you can see, but there's many, many little blue dots on this map, which are the Israeli settlements. Following the signing of the Accords in 1993, Israel made a huge infrastructure project called the Bypass Road, which was to build a new system of highways in the West Bank to connect the Israeli settlements to each other and to Israel around the islands of the newly created Palestinian autonomy, around the Palestinian cities, what is called the bypass roads, bridges, tunnels, investment really of hundreds of millions or maybe even billions of dollars going into this, sending a pretty clear message to Palestinians, which is we're not about to leave our settlements in the West Bank. which is further clarified when, after that, in 95, 96, Israel also starts to make huge new government building projects in the settlements of the West Bank and move more people in. So that if, and I'm skipping many things, but if at the signing of Oslo, Palestinians were split close to 50-50, it's a good idea or a bad idea to sign it, within a few years that dropped sharply. So that most people felt that the Oslo Accords were a mistake and that the people who signed them were either stupid or corrupt, or some combination of the two. They definitely were corrupt. Okay, whether they were or were not stupid is a hard question, but corruption is measurable, and there's organizations devoted to that. And the Palestinian Authority is one of the most corrupt government-like organizations in the world. Why and how? Well, one of the reasons is there is no possibility to have a functioning economy really inside these islands. Especially since for all the military government, Israel never allowed or invested in the development of industry or agriculture, but it encouraged people to come work inside Israel as laborers. And now with Oslo, they stopped allowing Palestinians into Israel as laborers. Inside here, there was very little infrastructure, and even if you could create something worth exporting, the physical act of exporting it would be very difficult through all the Israeli border controls, and your control of land and water resource very limited. So the Palestinian Authority created in Oslo is funded primarily, overwhelmingly with your tax money. In North America and Western Europe, the donor countries, so-called in the Oslo Accords, are sending a lot of money to fund the salaries, the hospitals, the schools, the roads, inside these little countries. Which, and I'm looking for alternative examples, but as far as I can figure, pretty much everywhere where you have aid-dependent governments, you have systemic corruption. Okay? The power is not coming from the people, it's coming from the outside. The people are on the way between that and the people. A lot of that money ends up being Mercedes, swimming pools, Swiss bank accounts. So the Palestinian Authority ruling inside these islands, a deeply corrupt organization, controlled in fact ultimately still by Israel and by the donor countries, which can give or withhold money, not owing really anything to the population. This situation made very many people unhappy. There was a growing Palestinian dissatisfaction with Oslo. In the year 2000, it was Bill Clinton who called Ehud Barak, the Israeli Prime Minister, and Yasser Arafat, the head of the Palestinian Authority, to Camp David, and told them, now you've got to finally talk about those final status issues. Jerusalem, the refugees, the waters, the borders, the airspace. How will they be resolved? We can't keep this temporary situation going on too long, which, by the way, is still today the situation. Okay? That didn't work. I'm giving you the end already. But what exactly happened in Camp David before those negotiations failed, I don't know. Because it was all top secret, no protocols were written and no journalists were allowed. And later, different people who were there gave very disparate versions of what actually happened there. I'm going to tell you the version of Ehud Barak, the Israeli Prime Minister, not because I believe it necessarily to be more true than any of the others, but maybe because it became the most famous version of what happened in Camp David. It in itself, that story affected later history, so it's useful to know. Ehud Barak loves to talk about, in Camp David, he made the generous offer. Okay, what exactly is the generous offer made by Ehud Barak to Palestinians in Camp David? He says he offered Palestinians independence in about 90% of the West Bank. So to go from here, from these Palestinian islands being only about 40% of the West Bank, to Palestine controlling 90% of the West Bank, connecting these islands together basically, and only about 10% of the West Bank, said Ehud Barak, what he calls the settlement blocks, areas where there was too many Israeli settlers to move, those areas would be annexed to Israel. Where exactly are these settlement blocks? Ehud Barak never publicly showed a map, but he made statements about this that give names of the main locations and from which you can sort of draw, and I haven't drawn this on any map because whatever line I would draw would be a little bit off. So I can try to show you on this map, we're talking about an area here around Jerusalem, and an area here along the western edge of the West Bank. That's what El-Bak is talking about, the settlement blocks. And at the same time, inside the same offer, he talked about the settlement blocks and a narrow strip, maybe half-mile wide strip, along the Jordan River. That would stay under Israeli control. Now, this area around Jerusalem, if it were to remain under Israeli control, would mean not only control of access to Palestinian East Jerusalem, but also control of access between the north and south of the West Bank. Controlling here the western West Bank would mean not only controlling the richest farmland in the West Bank, but also the access to the western mountain aquifer, a big underground water resource that's very important here. And controlling the Jordan would mean controlling all the land borders of the West Bank, and since part of al-Barak's statement was that Israel must remain in control of the whole airspace, in fact, al-Barak's offer is to say, in other words, our generous offer to you, the most generous offer we can make to you, take it or leave it, is where you will get complete independence, controlling everything except your borders, your airspace, your water resources, your internal movement, and your access to your capital. For whatever reason, and really I'm not going into this now, the Camp David negotiations failed. And shortly after that, there breaks out the Second Intifada. Okay, the Second Intifada is an interesting thing, which I've been trying to figure out lately, how it broke out and what. It's not completely clear, I think, whether it originally broke out against Arafat, the leader who had signed the Oslo Accords, or against Israel. And I think for many people in the West Bank at that point it was not clear that these were two different things. Okay? But Arafat had the political savvy to immediately join in. To realize that his other choice was to be toppled, and to say, yes, this is a true uprising of the people, and I am its leader. At which point Israel broke off all relations with the Palestinian Authority. International funders basically broke off all their funding to the Palestinian Authority. And there evolved a kind of war where Palestinians used both guerrilla tactics and terror, and bombed from the air all kinds of places where it thought were centers of resistance, so that in the 4 years, let's say from October of 2000 to November of 2004, when the Second Intifada was, about 1,000 Israelis died, the great majority of them civilians. About 4,000 Palestinians died, the great majority of them civilians. But the Second Intifada ended with Israel effectively crushing the uprising and with no political achievements for Palestinians. If anything, the other way. If anything, Palestinians were set back at the end of it from where they were in the beginning, because, for different reasons, but one is suicide bombers brought basically an end to almost any international support that Palestinians may have had previously. And Israel was able to use maybe a certain moment, which was also around September 11th, say we are on the side of the West against irrational terror, and get the support of Europe and the US, which is very important in this game, for its agenda. Arafat died during this situation after having been for several weeks under siege, basically, in his office. In his place came Mahmoud Abbas, who to this day leads the Palestinian Authority unelected, largely placed there by the US and Israel, with the agenda of just let's try to keep things quiet. And at the same time, during the Second Intifada, Israel started building the separation wall, or security barrier, or different names we have for this fence or wall, which is in theory running between the West Bank and Israel, but actually leaving on the Israeli side about 10% of the West Bank, a very similar line to that which El-Barak was talking about in Camp David. Leaving on the Israeli side the rich farmlands, the water resources, and the area around Jerusalem, controlling access to Jerusalem and movement between North and South West Bank. sending a message to Palestinians, maybe in one way or another, saying, you did not accept our offer in negotiation. That's too bad, really, but we don't need you to. We can unilaterally create the border that we want to see, and more, when the strength started to be built, and Israeli government came under attack for it internationally, building a wall into what's called by international law occupied territory, then Israel said, look, it's not a border, it's just a temporary security emergency thing to stop suicide bombers. So they started building it in 2003. Suicide bombers ended in 2004. In 2014, it's still under construction. And more Israeli politicians are already saying, look, we've started a security emergency measure, but now that it's almost done, we think it would make a pretty good border. How about that? And so we have this area, the Western West Bank, and the area around Jerusalem, which has been, or is in some places still being finished off. The sealing off of that from the rest of the West Bank. Around Jerusalem is pretty much finished. And in these areas, the Israeli government is undertaking a policy which it calls Judaization, which is a policy of trying to get as many Israeli Jews to move into these areas, from Tel Aviv, from Jerusalem, with economic incentives, planned neighborhoods, all kinds of things. And at the same time trying to get Palestinians to move out of these areas into the islands of the autonomy through basically, it's the reverse of incentives, but a system of policies and planning which makes it difficult for Palestinians to live here and encourage them, in fact, to move there. All of this is intended. What is it intended for? Okay, I don't know exactly. But we can imagine that if it were successful, the Israeli politicians might offer Palestinians maybe something like this. Okay, this map has no official has ever shown it. I'm just trying to go on trends. So it seems like Israel is, what it's talking about is to allow Palestinians to connect some of the islands of the autonomy to each other, to create some larger unit, which in the fantasy of Israeli policymakers, it would be called independent Palestine. That is, they would get some Palestinian politician to sign and say, all right, we are independent here, and on the dotted line here. And they would, in fact, retain control of it. Okay? Because if Palestine is like this, Israel controls all the entrances and exits, the airspace, the water resources, the movement. It still allows Israel ultimate control of the land and water resources and of the population indirectly. So in order for this to happen, a very key element is here in Jerusalem, which has already been walled off from the rest of the West Bank. And there is a policy, an ongoing policy here, which is trying to encourage Jews to move into these areas, encourage Palestinians to move out of them. And that is basically enough introduction, I hope, to take us from here to go towards our bus, take a drive around Jerusalem, around a mile or two outside the old city, around it, to see what's happening today in the Palestinian neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, how they are affected by these policies. All right, that's 2:10. Questions, comments, thoughts, but not all at once.
What you said is sobering.
All right, that's a comment. Good. Sobering, definitely we'd rather be sober, right? It's better than depressing. I like that, sobering. Yeah.
So you don't see anything happening in the near future?
Oh, sure. This situation is, with one thing we can tell from all this, the situation is by no means static. And also, I would argue it is not sustainable. It cannot last forever. It's bound for one sort of crisis or collapse or another, into violence, into a fundamental change of the political system, I think there's different options, and I'm not sure which is coming, but I definitely do think that we're going to see change.
What is your background?
I'm an Israeli Jew from West Jerusalem. I've worked in different capacities, mostly volunteer with different human rights and political organizations here in Jerusalem. I've never been educated formally.
Wow.
In that sense. Yes.
What is your assessment of the Palestinian leadership at this point?
That it's largely missing. Look, this is the last thing maybe we'll say here, then we can talk on the bus. But the Israeli policy here has largely been, if there's been a clear policy, it's been to make the lives of people in the West Bank uncomfortable for the past almost 50 years. And before that, the people under Israeli control. And you could say maybe the fantasy at the end of that would be for Palestinians to all up and leave somewheres, except generally where they're going to go. But educated people with the right kind of contacts and professions do leave. So there is a huge, at least large, in many cases wealthy and educated Palestinian communities in North America, in South America, in Australia, in all kinds of places. The section of the population that would be the potential for a civil leadership is largely missing. And the general trend is for the educated and professional to leave, which doesn't make them less people, because poor people have more babies.
Yes.
And so the population is growing, but the leadership layer, let's say, of the population is certainly not.